Hi, I'm Angelo Gavrielatos, Project Director, Education International. Before I go to the issue at hand today, I want to make some opening observations. And the first one relates to the right of education. If we are to realise that fundamental right to education for every child, we need to acknowledge that it will only be achieved through quality public education for all. A public school of the highest quality, free, universally accessible for all. A public school of the highest quality in every community, which sets the standard for quality. To achieve that, of course, we need governments to fulfil their responsibility, their obligation, in fact, to properly and adequately fund public schooling. Unfortunately, we're seeing more and more governments abrogate that responsibility and outsource that responsibility to the private sector. The other observation I'd like to make is that we now have a body of research, evidence, that tells us that the application of market principles in the provision of education does not improve educational outcomes. In fact, it will contribute to a deepening inequality and segregation in the provision of education. Yet despite that evidence, governments continue to willfully ignore it and indeed misrepresent the evidence in pursuit of an ideological position in support of privatising education. Regrettably, we need to deal with that reality. And it's within that context that this discussion is occurring today, where we ask ourselves, well, what are the requirements? What is it that we would require of governments in the sense of a legislative framework, a regulatory framework, in order to offer certain protections in such a deregulated environment, or protections in an environment where PPPs are being promoted? Well, the first thing I'd say is that in such an environment we should demand a legislative framework, legislative support and guarantees that go to the questions of minimum qualifications for teachers and the delivery of curriculum in schools. We need to ensure that those charged with the responsibility of educating our children meet the qualifications, the requirements to be a teacher. In far too many cases, we're seeing private companies seek to employ fewer teachers, underqualified teachers, or unqualified personnel to deliver education programs because that is the easiest and cheapest and nastiest way to improve their bottom line, their profit. We know that a school's budget, about 80% of it, is teacher salaries. So the easiest way to make profit is by undermining that fundamental right of every child to a qualified teacher. The next thing that would be required goes to the question of curriculum. We need to ensure that all operators offer the same curriculum that is required of all schools. We would go on to say that that curriculum should be of high quality, rigorous, rich and rewarding. But what it can't be is reduced to a standardised format which allows companies to achieve economies of scale and therefore increase their profit. We'd also require and demand a legislative framework and guarantees that go to questions of facilities. Minimum requirements with respect to facilities, sanitation, lighting. These may sound like obvious things, but there are far too many places in the world where they're being denied to students. So there's some of the areas that you'd look to be included in a legislative framework. But we'd also go further than that. And I'm informed by practice in Australia, legal practice in Australia. In Australia, any non-state actor, and they are primarily traditional non-state actors in the form of schools provided by religious organisations, any non-state actor that provides schooling and is in receipt of any government funding, whether it's 10% of their operation or 90% of the operation, anyone in receipt of any government funding in Australia must be non-commercial in character. They can't run for profit. That is a requirement by Australian law at the federal level and the state level. And I would think it should be a requirement for any operator. So we say that if you're in receipt of any government funding, directly or indirectly, and I put that in the sense that in many countries in the developing world, they get government funding indirectly through aid agencies. So if you're in receipt of any government funding directly or indirectly, domestically or extraterritorially, well then you must be non-commercial in character. Now if that squeezes out corporate actors who are driven by the profit motive, well so be it. Because as far as we're concerned, the profit motive has no place in dictating what is taught in schools, how it's taught in schools, how it's assessed nor how our schools are organised. This is a serious proposition, and this discussion is occurring at a time where I believe that great social enterprise of public education is under greater threat than it's ever been. We need to mobilise our forces in order to ensure a public school of the highest quality in every community. Thank you.